Tenakoto Katoa. I am Professor Mohan Dara, Director of the Center for Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation Care. And I'm delighted to share with you my thoughts on Hindutva, the ideology of hate that forms the basis of ongoing Islamophobia and attacks on Dalit and Christian minorities in India, and connected to the circulation of hate here in the diaspora. This is part of our broader End the Hate lecture series, and connected with CARE's ongoing work with voices of communities at the margins of India and of the Indian diaspora here in Aotearoa. We are particularly interested in the role of communication and the ways in which communication is used to hold up this infrastructure of hate and to circulate it. So, what I will particularly attend to today is the notion of Hindu phobia, which is a manufactured concept, a concept that articulates the fear of the Hindu as a communicative device in order to prop up, legitimize, and circulate Hindutva. So I will critically interrogate that narrative and look at the different elements of that narrative that hold it together. And in doing so, I will draw upon a key communication concept. Now, I will go over this concept later in the talk as well. The concept is communicative inversion, which is the turning of materiality on its head, the turning of empirical evidence on its head through communication resources, infrastructures, and communication frames. So, to begin with, let's unpack a little bit what I mean by Hindutva, how I define it, and how I see it connected to the politics of hate. Now, Hindutva is an ethno nationalist ideology that constructs India as a Hindu nation. So, it imagines India as a Hindu nation. So, if you look at images of India constructed in the ideology of Hindutva, these images demonstrate the map painted in saffron, or they demonstrate the mother India, who is superimposed on the backdrop of the map. And the idea behind this ethno nationalist ideology is that India is a Hindu nation where its Muslim and Christian minorities don't really have a place. So, this forms then the basis of the infrastructure of hate that holds up Hindutva. The hate is disseminated through ongoing othering of Christians and Muslims, and particularly with an emphasis on targeting Muslims, and is in that sense deeply rooted in the circulation of Islamophobia. So, in the image that you have on the screen here, this is one of the outfits of the Hindutva, the Bajrang Dal. And you see the images here of the Trishul, which is a weapon that is then metaphorically, communicatively displayed as sort of a trope for taking back India to its Hindu identity, for returning the glory of Hindu India, and simultaneously then erasing its Muslim margins. Now, this ideology of Hindutva, in this sense, then has to construct Hinduism in a particular way as a religion that offers the basis for the imagination of the nation. And this goes fundamentally against the constitutional imaginary of India as a secular, socialist, democratic republic, because it manufactures the image of India on the very basis of its Hinduness and its Hindu identity. So, to carry out this politics of hate that forms the infrastructure of Hindutva, the language of Hinduphobia is manufactured. Hinduphobia, as constructed by the proponents of Hindutva, is the fear of the hatred toward racism toward Hindus, and it is precisely weaponized in order to legitimize, I would argue, the apparatus of Hindutva. So, in other words, the production of the Hindu being the target of attacks, the Hindu being the subject of racism and intolerance and hate and violence, becomes the basis for legitimizing the process of othering, the process of producing the other, but B, it also becomes a way for silencing any critique of the apparatus of hate that underlies Hindutva. So we have seen within the context of India, and particularly so in the diaspora since the election of the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, and particularly the election of Narendra Modi as the prime minister, that this process of generating the Hinduphobia, the construction of Hinduphobia, has actually become salient. Hinduphobia has been weaponized in order to target any critique of Hindutva. And in order to, in that sense, legitimize the climate of hate, we have seen since 2015 the various forms of targeted attacks that have been directed at Muslims. And these forms of attacks have often been justified by Islamophobic discourse. Along with that, then, we have seen an ongoing process of undoing history to redo it. So, Hindutva needs to construct a particular narrative of India, which is the narrative of Hindu India, with Hindus being the original people of India, the indigenous people of India. In order to do so, Hindutva needs to do two things. One is to deny the empirical evidence that documents various migratory patterns that constitute the history of India. And second, it needs to then produce um, uh, a history based upon imagination that constructs India in the image of its traditional Hindu culture, the Sanatan culture, which is primordial, non changing, and eternal in that sense. So, this communicative construction relies upon this process of continually undoing history, and connected to that, then the continual production of communicative erasures. The Muslims and the history of Muslims in India. Um, uh, Christians have to be continually erased from this discursive space of India for India to be imagined in the notion of a Hindu state. And this then is this narrative is held up by an entire digital infrastructure of hate that continually produces the other, continually challenges history, and in order to do so manufactures um, ideas, communicative tropes such as history of India historically has been written by the British, or the history of India has been written by the Marxists. And this has resulted in Indian history being distorted. So, that particular communicative inversion is essential for Hindutva to then prop up its notion of Hindus being the only indigenous people of India. And within this infrastructure then of hate, what is critical to note is this interplay with white supremacy. Hindutva aligns with forces of white supremacy in its targeting of Muslims, in its perpetuation of Islamophobia. And in fact, we have seen this historically in terms of the linkages between Hindutva ideologues and fascist ideologues, Nazi ideologues, and then playing out within the contemporary context to the references to Hindutva and principles of Hindutva made by a number of white supremacists. So, in the backdrop of this politics of hate that is carried out through these communication tropes that are continually erasing history, erasing empirical evidence in order to construct this imagination of India as a Hindu notion, nation, we see also ongoing attempts to silence voices of dissent and voices of critique. And this is where Hinduphobia comes in. The Hinduphobia, the fear of the Hindu and the hatred of the Hindu, is put up as a concept then to silence voices, and particularly so in the diaspora. So, to the extent that academics, activists in the diaspora offer critiques of the Hindutva narratives, or to the extent that empirical work of academics interrogate the narratives of Hindutva, they become the subjects of attack, and that attack is held up by the communicative device of Hinduphobia. So, Hinduphobia, or the notion of fear toward the Hindu, is used to silence voices that actually question the real hate that is perpetuated by Hindutva toward Dalits, Muslims, and Christians in India. It is used to attack any form of dissent that interrogates and questions the monolithic narrative of Hindutva. It has been used in various forms to imprison protesters, actually connected to notions of security. So, those that question Hindutva and interrogate its narratives are security threats to the safety of the nation. And that narrative then is used to target protesters and dissenters. And we have seen on an ongoing basis this take place in India, with a number of protesters continuing to be in jail for questioning the othering process that is being carried out by the Bharatiya Janata Party to produce this Hindu nation. This is also evident in the attacks on academics, particularly academics that have been concerned about Hindutva, whose empirical work has demonstrated the various effects of Hindutva, and whose scholarship challenges the narratives of Hindutva. So, we, for instance, have seen how powerfully this narrative of Hinduphobia has been deployed by Hindu students, or groups that are framed as the Hindu students, as if there is a monolithic organized identity of Hindu students at Rutgers University to target Professor Audrey Tutchke. And what we see happen in that process is that the narrative of Hindutva, the appeal of Hindutva, is connected to the narrative of Hinduphobia, then to articulate that the academics that are questioning that particular communicative construction are spreading hate toward the Hindus. So that kind of a simplistic labeling then works as a basis for organizing in attempts to silence voices. Similarly, critiques in the diaspora, those academics, activists of Indian origin that have interrogated the forces of Hindutva, that have expressed concerns about the depletion of democracy in India, have found themselves as targets of these attacks. I have witnessed this in my work here in Aotearoa in terms of interrogating the Hindutva narratives here in Aotearoa. And what is at the heart of that attack, once again, is to frame those academics, and again, many of those of Indian origin, as foreign influences influenced by the West, or as Marxist academics committed to destroying the vision of India. So, the key point here to remember, of course, is that what is actually happening is that academics, activists are questioning the vision of the Hindutva India, which is a vision based upon the notion of hate and othering and disenfranchising of minorities. But that is, again, this is an example of communicative inversion where that is turned on its head to attack and silence those voices. So, Hinduphobia offers the basis for organizing and mobilizing um, forces, Hindutva forces in the diaspora, across the diaspora, connected to Hindutva forces in India to silence the critiques of what's going on in India at this point, and particularly in terms of the various structural ways in which Muslims are being disenfranchised. So I now want to come to the notion of the narrative structure. Narrative structure is the structure of a story. Yeah. So, what is the narrative structure of the Hinduphobia? Well, the narrative of Hinduphobia relies upon five key elements. So the first is that it needs to produce this articulation of hate toward Hindus, and I will unpack that a little bit in terms of the context of racism and racist experiences by people from the South Asian subcontinent, and how that is then turned into a construction of hate toward Hindus. Then the second point, and that is a connected point, is this notion of safety. So, justice-based concerns about safety of minority communities in multiple multicultural contexts, and particularly within academic spaces, have been weaponized and deployed to raise questions of safety for Hindus, very much within the umbrella of the agenda of Hinduphobia serving Hindutva. There are references made to incidences of hate, and we will look at how these incidences of hate actually are narrativized, are storied in particular ways to prop up the agendas of Hindutva. Also targeting critiques and those scholars that interrogate Hindutva as spreading Western hegemony, and then deploying the narrative of decolonization and post-colonial theory and cultural studies, talking about concepts such as emic research, in order to silence the critiques of Hindutva. So all of this is based upon that concept of communicative inversion. And in my work, what I argue is communicative inversion is the process of turning the material, the empirical, into its opposite. And it becomes possible through a range of symbolic resources, a range of communicative devices that are deployed to do so. So discursive or communicative strategies uh, are mobilized in order to turn materiality on its head. And this becomes a basis for imagining the articulation of a nation. So, for Hindutva, communicative inversion forms the basis through which it can imagine the Hindu nation in the contemporary context. So, the Hindu as the victim. And what is really powerful here, if you look at the context of contemporary India, is that it is a Hindu majority state. And yet, within that context, it is the Hindu that is produced as a victim in order to hold up the infrastructures of Hindutva. In that sense, the strategy here is quite similar to the strategy of white supremacy, and particularly the ways in which white supremacy deploys the communicative inversion of vulnerability, where the white race is vulnerable because it is being taken over by diverse communities and diverse cultures. And that then becomes the narrative basis for hate. So there is actually quite a similarity in terms of the ways in which this particular communicative inversion of grievance gets worked up and worked into the project of Hindutva. Now, therefore, within this context, any kind of protest against the infrastructure of Hindutva, against this hateful imaginary of India as a Hindu nation, based upon principles of exclusion, any kind of protest against that is seen as a pathology, is seen as a threat to the security of the nation. And you have to understand this within the context of the communicative devices that construct that nation that I was talking about earlier, which is that the very communicative device that imagines India as a saffron nation, and to the extent that India and Hindus, and particularly Hindus organized within the structure of Hindutva, becomes synonymous. Any kind of protest against that becomes a threat to the security of the nation. So, one of the first strategies of Hinduphobia is its deployment of racism, and particularly its capacity to invert the narrative of racism to construct Hinduphobia. And I will argue that this is actually one of the key elements in the production and circulation of Hinduphobia. First, let's look at the facts, right? So, within a large number of Western contexts. If you look at the evidence in the US, in the United Kingdom, we also look at, if we look at studies in Australia or here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, racism is experienced by South Asians as a broader community, and racism is certainly experienced by Indians. There is ample empirical evidence to document that. This racism is often based on appearance, based upon how you look. It is often based upon speech and accent, diction, language, and visible communicative practices. It is based upon cultural practices, practices such as food, practices such as eating habits. So, say, for instance, you have seen in multiple contexts the racist construction of the Indian that smells of curry, that is deployed um, as a strategy to discriminate. We have seen this play out, for instance, within the context of housing policies, with Indians facing struggles in renting apartments because of prejudiced worldviews of renters. And this certainly can also be seen within the context of white supremacy, and particularly white supremacist attacks on Indians and incidences of hate that we have seen um, within various contexts. In the US, we have seen hate in the United Kingdom, we have seen hate in Australia. Now, this is also in some ways connected to Islamophobia, because post 9/11, where uh, the climate was actively mobilized to produce Islamophobia, um, and that was visibly directed at people that were brown skinned. Many Indians, say for instance in the US, experienced the hate, and again this is documented, because they were um, assumed to be Muslims. Now, they might or might not have been Muslims. And certainly, again, those Indians that were visibly different, or that might have been uh, understood to be Muslims visually, and that included Sikhs, for instance, were more likely to face these attacks. So, in fact, if you see the experiences of racism and the empirical evidence documenting racism experienced by Indians in the diaspora, particularly within the context of countries that have white majority, the racism is often directed at skin color, and there is hardly any evidence of systematic targeting of Hindus or Hindu faith. Now, within the context of cultural practices, because that's a broad umbrella, there are evidences of hate that, for instance, have been directed at eateries, or within the context of Aotearoa, at dairies that are often owned by Indians. And there have been incidences of hate that have been targeted at temples. But these also need to be read as a broader constellation of cultural practices, which also include attacks on gurudwaras, where Sikhs worship, attacks on mosques. Certainly, we saw in the Christchurch attack that a large number of worshippers that went to the mosque were actually from South Asia, brown skinned people. So we need to really look at the ways in which racism and the empirical evidence on racism that actually exists across multiple Western societies is deployed by the Hindutva forces to manufacture the narrative of Hindutva. The second element, and that is tied to this, is the notion of safety, and how then the concept of safety for Hindu students, the safety for Hindu academics to voice their Hindutva ideology becomes the basis for organizing. And once again, to achieve this, material practices are inverted. So, say, for instance, historic events are inverted. Multiple um, Hindutva related organizations in different parts of the world often, for instance, will use the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War as an example of Muslim attack on Hindus. If you actually look at the history and the context of the war, and this is within the context of the partition, and then sort of the struggle, um, the, the linguistic struggle of Bengalis in Bangladesh against the hegemony of Pakistani governance. And really, if you think about the Bangladesh struggle of 1971, it is called Bhasha Andolon. It is the struggle over language and over linguistic identity. And that is inverted entirely and constructed as hatred toward Hindus in order to prop up an example of Hinduphobia. Similarly, a range of contemporary practices or contemporary events are framed as attacks on Hindus while simultaneously erasing the actual violence experienced by Muslims in India carried out by the Hindutva forces, be it in the form of lynchings, be it in the forms of mob-based harassment, be it in the form of this state-directed Citizenship Amendment Act. And those are erased and obfuscated as the Hindu as a victim is produced. So erasing oppressions is a key element of this communicative inversion, where caste, the oppressions of caste, Islamophobia, gender oppressions are continually erased in order to produce the narrative of the Hindu India. And then any critique of this hate that is continuing to grow rapidly in India, particularly in the last 6 years, is turned into as a threat to safety. So a student can write in. So, say a student is in a classroom and the politics of Hindutva is being discussed. A student can write in and say that I'm feeling unsafe in the classroom. So safety is weaponized in order to silence legitimate critiques. And this we often see in the forms of organized attacks. So the Rutgers, the attack that happened on Professor Tashki, uh, a big part of that attack was carried out through the language of future students, with future students writing in, look, I feel unsafe coming to Rutgers because Hindus uh, are not treated in safe ways here. And all of this within the context of, if you go back to my earlier examples, within the context of um, Professor Tashki's work, directly interrogating the narrative construction of Hindus as the only indigenous people of India and excluding Muslims and the history of Muslim syncretism and Muslim participation in the construction of India's imaginary. So, along with this kind of articulation of safety, any kind of theoretical critique is presented as Western hegemony. And as someone who writes about decolonization processes, this is one part I find particularly powerful, because critiques of whiteness as an infrastructure that holds up white ideology as normal and normative, and simultaneously erases diverse voices at the margin. Now, that critique is incorporated into this narrative of Hindutva to label any critique of Hindutva as Western hegemony. So, the empirical evidence, for instance, that documents that people migrated into what is considered as India from other parts, and that formed part of the formation of the Hindu civilization in India. Now, that empirical evidence is constructed as Western, or as a Western construction. Now, what that enables is that it enables Hindutva then to articulate the notion of the Hindus as the um, uh, indigenous people of India, while excluding Muslims and Christians, and actually then legitimizes this politics of hate. And it simultaneously erases the Adivasis of India, who continue to struggle within the context of the state's colonial practices. And then Indians that critique these forces of Hindutva and their consolidation of narratives in monolithic terms are labeled as Marxist or communist threats. So the production of uh, the Indian critique as sort of product of westernization, as a product of Marxist theory, then actually works to silence critiques of Hindutva. Now, one of the things I want to point out here also is the similarity and commonality of the thread between um, the kind of narratives of Hinduphobia that we see here, and the attacks on critical race theory by white supremacists that we see within the context of the US, or multiple European countries that we are seeing right now. So these critiques being Marxist, being against the interests of the nation, being divisive, are deployed as strategies then to hold up sort of the hegemony of these forces of hate. So this component is an important irony here, because on one hand, if you or the paradox here. So on one hand, if you look at Hindutva and its critique of Western hegemony, it is taking a position that the West has historically read India, it has the history wrong, therefore Indians need to write their own history, of course, particular version of Indians who belong to the ideological camp of Hindutva. Simultaneously, as it does so, it actually copies the strategies of white supremacy and white supremacist hate. The next element is the co-option of decolonization. So, if you think about decolonization as the struggle against colonial forces, uh, and particularly connecting it to the question of indigenous struggles, it is ongoing indigenous struggle against settler colonial forces, then consider the ways in which the language of decolonization here is incorporated in order to establish Hindu hegemony. So the notion of indigeneity is really critical here in terms of how it is reworked by Hindutva and how it is being deployed here. So raising the notion that um, India as a country is built upon migration, and that includes Hindus um, who sort of uh, came to be as a product of, constituted by forces of migration, as did Muslims in India. Now, that history is reworked in order to articulate that Hindus were the only indigenous people of India. So, and here, there is a critical point here, that if you think about the question of indigeneity, that is always connected to the question of time. You use a point of time to think through who is indigenous. So, for the agenda of uh, Hindutva forces, the point of time that is used is connected to this notion that Hindus have always been the people of India, and then the Muslim invaders came into India. So those were the others that came into India, and then the uh, colonizing forces of the British came into India that brought in Christianity. So the Hindu nation, in that sense, um, uh, has to be imagined through the othering of these forces that migrated in. And of course, in order to establish that, um, the empirical evidence has to be undermined. This theory of migration has to be dismantled. And to dismantle that, Hindutva draws on the narrative of decolonization, on the tools of decolonization. And in doing so, it also produces a particular kind of cultural essentialism in its projection of Hinduism as Sanatana Dharma, that goes back to time and eternity, that is non changing, that is permanent, and that just passes on. And of course, that again goes against the notion of cultures being dynamic, cultures being transformative, cultures being changing. And there are many sort of entry points to looking at this. So, in that sense, even if you look at sort of the history of emergence of Hinduism and movements within Hinduism, with significant questions like the question of the cow and the relationship with the cow, which for the Sangh has become, for the Hindutva forces, has become a key element in their narrative. There actually have been historical records that talk about, the various forms of agrarian relationships with cows, and the various practices related to cows, and not the monolithic practices that constitute the communicative infrastructure of Hindutva, that prop up cows as sacred and therefore organize the violence on Muslims around the politics of the cow. Or similarly, you consider the question of eroticism in various forms of Hinduism, and the flows and uh, disjunctures, the fragments, the different forms of practices. Now, Hindutva, seeking to assert its monolithic definition of Hinduism, has to undermine and unsee those. So it has to produce a cultural essentialism, which actually, if you think about it, is a mirror image of the strategies of the colonizer. So in that sense, it actually replicates the whiteness of colonialism, where culture is an essence, culture is unchanging, culture is not transformative, not dynamic, in order to sort of set up its hegemony. So, in fact, rather than, I would argue, being an anchor to decolonization, Hindutva reflects fundamentally the principles of colonization. The basic notion of culture as essence unchanging, that has been used by colonialists historically. So this notion then is used discursively to argue that it is only Hindus that can talk about Hindus. So this turn to by Hindus for Hindus, and of course within this, what is really powerful to witness is that um, you have to ask who is the right Hindu to theorize about the Hindus, and it is the Hindutva Hindu who can really rightfully theorize about the Hindus. So the cultural insider is a particular kind of cultural insider. But again, you see how this draws and makes a caricature of decolonization movements, and particularly movements of indigenous communities in settler colonies that continue to argue for Tinuranga Tiratanga, as we say here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the concept of sovereignty, that indigenous communities ought to have sovereignty over the processes of knowledge production. So that fundamental argument is taken and turned into its caricature in order to carry out the agendas of Hindutva in a way that serves very much the colonial infrastructure of knowledge production. So, in this process, also what is erased is the history of collaboration that the ideology of Hindutva held with the colonizer. So, historically, within the context of India's freedom struggle and its decolonization struggle, its anti colonial struggle, we need to remember that the forces of Hindutva were aligned with forces of British colonialism. But that history, of course, is erased in order to put up this seduction. And simultaneously erased our notions of indigeneity, even um, within the context of contemporary struggles of indigenous peoples in India. India's Adivasi people with land, with ownership of natural resources, with access to their livelihoods and habitat. In fact, a lot of those struggles are framed in simplistic terms as being Maoist struggles or as being Marxist struggles to threaten the security of the state. So, what is really powerful here is consider the ways in which actually within this narrative infrastructure, the real decolonizing struggles of India's Adivasi people are continually erased, obfuscated, but also become the sites for police military state violence. So this becomes the basis for the ongoing colonization of indigenous peoples within India, and erasure of the lived experiences of those indigenous communities, and often in the form of Adivasi people being targeted through initiatives of education. So Hindutva runs a series of educational initiatives to pretty much uplift the indigenous people. So in parts of India where I have done my field work, I found the forces of Hindutva at work through schooling systems targeting indigenous people and indigenous communities. So there are ongoing processes of colonization at work. So, what is really powerful here and worth noting is that the language of decolonization is actually being deployed to carry out colonization, to assert colonial culture and erase Adivasi cultures and the diversity of Adivasi cultures. And then this is also tied to the ongoing colonization of indigenous land and the erasure of indigenous struggles for dignity and land. So if we look at this entire infrastructure of decolonization, what we see here is that decolonization to serve the narrative of Hinduphobia is actually a communicative inversion of decolonization theory in order to prop up this infrastructure of hate. So, what I have done today is looked at the notion of Hinduphobia and its narrative structure, particularly in the ways in which it is being deployed to silence critiques of Hinduphobia. the ways in which the language of safe spaces, the language of de-Westernization, decolonization that forms the basis of social justice struggles are actually being deployed to hold up this infrastructure of hate in the diaspora and connected to the hate in India. So looking forward, I want to wrap up by asking what can we do to disrupt these communicative inversions? And the first point is that we all have to be aware of the ways in which these communicative inversions are being carried out. We have to look at materiality and the ways in which materiality is continually being turned on its head, particularly in terms of this production of grievance. We have seen this within the context of white supremacy. We certainly see that in our work on white supremacy here in Aotearoa, but we see a mirroring of the same strategy with the Hindutva supremacists in terms of the production of the grievance, the production of the Hindu under threat, while actually a majoritarian politics of hate is being perpetuated in India, targeting minorities. We need to make visible these linkages, and particularly so in terms of the linkages between political economic forces and these discourses. We need to recognize that these forces do not operate as trolls. I think we too often tend to think of the army of hate of Hindutva as trolls and leave it at that. And we really need to look at who is funding these trolls, where are the economic forces coming from. We need to articulate academic freedom on the notions of justice, and we need to really carefully look at the ways in which the language of decolonization, the language of justice, are being deployed within the context of academic freedom. We fundamentally need to stand by each other and stand by academics, activists that are being targeted, harassed, all the way from being harassed by the troll army to being harassed by the Hindutva forces. And we need to make visible the structures of hate at work in that process. So, as you can see, there is a continuity between the trolls that send hateful, violent, threatening messages to the campus activists that are organizing to silence these articulations. We need to see these infrastructures of hate. And in that process, we need to build solidarities with academics, with activists, with communities. We need to create pedagogies, and we need to recognize the ways in which hate flows. I want to come back to one of the key points that I noted earlier, that the Hindutva hate actually intersects with white supremacist hate. We need to look at those closely. Too often in liberal multicultural democracies, we tend to ignore these kinds of forces in the migrant diaspora. And often, in fact, because of our ignorance and lack of education, we tend to fund these forces as exemplars of multiculturalism. And we actually, in that process, perpetuate the infrastructure of hate and hold it up. So in that sense, there's also a key element here in terms of pedagogy of our politicians to closely look at hate and the ways in which hate flows globally, and the various agendas of hate intersect with each other. Thanks for listening to this talk. In subsequent talks, we will come back to particular instances, and I will walk through the examples of how this hate apparatus works, just to have an understanding of the communicative infrastructures. Thank you.